In the 80s and 90s, Sonic Youth kind of became the coolest band in the world. Every cool person you knew claimed to like them, and every artist wanted to be them. But things for the band weren't always quite that smooth. This is the story of Sonic Youth. This was another video idea that was recommended to me by a subscriber, so as always, if you have an artist or a band that you would love to learn more about and you think their story would make for a great video, feel free to let me know. I'm always looking for suggestions. And then share this video if any of your friends are big Sonic Youth fans, or if you think someone might be interested in learning more music history, share this video with them, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories from music history. In 1977, Thurston Moore left Western Connecticut State University in order to move to New York City and be a part of the burgeoning punk scene. The Ramones released their debut album in 1976. Blondie was on their second album and on the cusp of mainstream success. Talking Heads released their first album that contained a smash hit called Psycho Killer. Television released Marquee Moon, which kind of gave a sound to that underground scene. The Patti Smith Group was out touring the world. Basically, just all of this great music was coming out of the New York underground scene, and Thurston wanted to be a part of it. Thurston's dad was a music teacher, and he was born in Florida, but the family quickly relocated to Connecticut. Thurston's teachers said that he spent way too much time daydreaming, and pretty early on in his life, he developed a love for stories and poetry. His dad played several instruments, and his parents kind of bonded over their shared love of music, which means Thurston grew up in a home just surrounded by different musical influences. But when he was growing up, his brother Gene was always considered the rock and roller. Gene was the one bringing home records by bands like Jefferson Airplane and the Beatles, and Gene was the one who first bought a guitar and started learning how to play it, and then he also started teaching Thurston how to play it. Gene actually had to lock his guitar in the case when he wasn't using it to stop Thurston from stealing it and playing around with it. Thurston had pretty eclectic taste and style in high school, which led him to be something of an outcast. He was kind of considered the class clown, but didn't have a ton of friends. But there was one friend he made who I believe was a year younger than him, who took him to see Patti Smith play at New York. That's when Thurston kind of became hooked on that underground scene and dedicated his life to being a musician. He said that when he first started hearing those underground and punk bands, that his old records, quote, got kind of put into the basement, and they were supplanted by the Sex Pistols and Blondie and Talking Heads and Susie and the Banshees. It was a completely new world, a new identity of music that was an option for youth culture. But he did end up deciding to do the sensible thing, and he enrolled in the college where his dad was a professor. But then, in 1978, Thurston's dad passed away from cardiac arrest, and as you might expect, that kind of threw everything in Thurston's life into flux. He ended up falling in with kind of a bad crowd and getting a little bit into drugs and other forms of debauchery. But then his old buddy, Harold Paris, who was the one who took him to see the Patti Smith Group, told him that he was moving to New York and wanted to know if Thurston wanted to tag along. So Thurston dropped out of college and he went. While living in the city, he got the chance to see so many great artists. Like, he kept going to Patti Smith shows. He got to see Talking Heads. He got to see John Cale and Philip Glass and just all of these really influential artists. Shortly after moving to the city, Thurston started a band called Room Tone, but then they quickly changed their name to the Coachmen. The Coachmen never really got anything going. They were begging to play shows for like $20, and then they would have to pay someone $25 to set up and tear down their set. But there is one good thing that did come from his time in the Coachmen, and that was meeting someone by the name of Kim Gordon. She had recently graduated from an art school on the West Coast, had just moved to the city, and actually attended their last show as the Coachmen. Kim was actually born in Rochester, New York, but her family moved to California when she was pretty young. Her father was a professor of sociology, and he took a job at UCLA. Kim said she remembers sitting around in her high school bedroom, smoking marijuana, listening to Joni Mitchell records, and just kind of dreaming of being a part of that Laurel Canyon art scene that was happening at the time. She always wanted to be an artist, but by the time she graduated Otis Art Institute, she knew that she needed to move to New York to be able to pursue that. That was where all of the cool avant-garde art that she was really into was really flourishing and happening, so she needed to move out there. She said, quote, "I hate the phrase reinvent yourself, but it was kind of like I had to live in New York to become who I always wanted to be," end quote. When she made it to New York, she became very plugged into the no-wave art movement. Alan Licht described the no-wave movement as, quote, the musicianship of the non-musician. He said, if you put an instrument in an interesting person's hands, they will do something interesting with it. And Kim really took that philosophy to heart. You know, I'm not gonna say she wasn't a good musician. Definitely at the end, she was exceptional. But at the start, she had no idea what she was doing. But that was fine. That was kind of all a part of the art of it. No wave was basically a rejection of everything. It was obviously a pushback against the new wave sound, which was heavily commercialized, but it was also a pushback against the punk sound. It basically thought that punk was just recycling the old cliches of the early days of rock and roll. It focused on noise and tonality and could a lot of times be very abrasive and annoying, kind of by design. Kim was all in on it. She even formed her first band because her upstairs neighbor, who was an artist by the name of Dan Graham, needed an all-girl band that could be a part of his performance art piece that he was going to be putting on in Boston. So Kim was a part of this band, and it was called a CKM, and it featured someone named Miranda Stanton, who was a lot more plugged into the music scene in New York than Kim was. It was actually Stanton Miranda that introduced Kim to Thurston, and Thurston, apparently the first time he went to that apartment, he saw Kim's bass that she had just got and was learning how to play and commented on it, and that's kind of how the whole thing got started. Kim and Thurston immediately hit it off and basically right away started playing some songs together. After the Coachmen broke up, they really started pursuing a musical partnership, and then they started to workshop a name for that new musical partnership. They threw around some names like Male Bonding or Red Milk, but in the end they settled on Sonic Youth, which was a combination of two different names. It was a combination of Fred Sonic Smith from the band MC5, legendary Detroit-based punk band, and it took the youth part from a reggae artist named Big Youth. Kim said that whenever Thurston suggested the name, it immediately unlocked something in their sound that they were trying to go for. Sonic Youth made their first appearance in 1981 at a kind of festival called Noise Fest. Kim and their friend Josh Bayer convinced Thurston to set up Noise Fest to showcase a lot of the noise rock and no wave bands that were experimenting with sound in New York. Those bands, obviously because they were doing something kind of brand new and against the grain, were having a real hard time finding work. They couldn't find gigs, and a lot of them were unemployed. So they came up with this idea to showcase a lot of them to get them some exposure. So Noise Fest was a 9-day festival that was held in an art gallery called White Columns that had a capacity of 60 people. 3 to 5 bands would play each night, depending on how long the bands played, and one of those bands was Glenn Barca's Electric Guitar Orchestra. So after their performance, Thurston called them, quote, the most ferocious guitar band that I'd ever seen in my life, end quote. And he had actually played in Glenn Barca's Electric Guitar Orchestra as well, where he met Lee Ronaldo. Thurston was very interested in what Lee was doing with the guitar and soon asked him to join Sonic Youth. Lee was born in Long Island, and he studied art at Binghamton University. He grew up on a lot of the psychedelic garage jam style rock bands, people like the Grateful Dead and Hot Tuna, but he also mixed that with a healthy diet of the early New York punk scene. So as a kid who grew up in New York City, he probably had a much easier time plugging into that music scene than Thurston or Kim did. In college, Lee started an experimental punk band that he called the Flukes, but they never really went anywhere. It was just an opportunity for Lee to kind of experiment and find out what sound he wanted. He tried to revive the Flukes after he graduated and moved into the city, but again, couldn't really get anything off the ground. So instead, he started playing guitar with other acts like Reese Chatham, and he even recorded with a band called Plus Instruments. But then Reese introduced Lee to an avant-garde musician that kind of changed Lee's life. Glenn Branco was from Pennsylvania, and he started playing guitar at the age of 15. He became interested in experimental theater, and then he lived in Boston and London for a while, but in 1976, he moved to New York. He first started trying to work in the theater industry, but quickly became fascinated with the music scene that was happening, and he started his own band. He ended up starting an electric guitar orchestra and recruited Lee and Thurston to play in that. Also, in 1982, he founded his own record label, but we'll get back to that in a bit. The trio of Thurston, Kim, and Lee found a drummer named Richard Edson, who was one of the founders of a San Francisco band known as the Altar Boys. So they recruited him in to kind of fill out the sound of Sonic Youth. But he was splitting his time between Sonic Youth and his other band called Conk. When Glenn started his record label, he signed Sonic Youth as his first band, and they released a debut self-titled EP, and it was not received well. After that, Richard left the band to focus on Conk, and he tried to get a bit of an acting career going. He had a few little parts and things. So the band replaced him with a New Jersey native named Bob Burt. But Bob didn't quite make it all that long in Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth became pretty good friends with a band called the Swans. They shared a rehearsal space, and when the Swans went on tour, they asked Sonic Youth to come open for them. And on that tour, Thurston kept criticizing Bob's drumming. So when they got back from that tour, Bob was fired, and he was replaced by a guy named Jim Scalvunis, who had really helped kickstart the no-wave movement with his band Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. In 1983, Sonic Youth went back into the studio and really actually started to find their sound in a more direct way. The album Confusion is Sex was way more loud and aggressive than their debut EP. When they were almost done with it, Jim quit the band, so they invited Bob back, who kind of finished up the recording. And after that, they went on a European tour after Bob made the band promise not to fire him at the end of that tour. People in New York and the American music scene in general really weren't all that interested in what Sonic Youth was doing, but when Sonic Youth played in Europe, they were incredibly well received. They even got great reviews when they played in London, and their equipment malfunctioned, which made Thurston very angry, and it was just a whole spectacle, but that ended up with really great reviews. I think it's worth noting that at the time, the European music scene was kind of just infatuated with the underground New York scene, so any band that came from that was going to get significant attention, and Sonic Youth were good enough to capitalize on that, where other underground bands maybe weren't quite as lucky. But the reviews in those magazines that were really respected in the American scene gave Sonic Youth a name when they finally came back to New York. People were finally starting to pay attention to them and really wanting to see them. Got to the point where they could pretty much book a show whenever they wanted to in New York.
So we're really sort of interested now in sort of professionalizing ourselves. Yeah. I mean, we've been around for a couple of years, and we're just working now on getting some kind of like business management together.
Sounds so strange.
It's pretty strange because we've always been pretty much do it yourself, and we set up the tours, totally ourselves. We use no agency whatsoever.
So 1984 was really shaping up to be their year. It was kind of capped by Thurston and Kim actually got married in 1984. They recorded a new album called Bad Moon Rising and then left Glenn Branca's label because of a dispute about unpaid royalties. They ended up signing with Homestead Records instead, which was an indie label based in Long Island. By the end of 1985, Bob Burt said that he was tired of playing the songs on the Bad Moon Rising album, and he quit the band again. This led them to bringing in Steve Shelley, who finally solidified the drummer spot. No more drummer turnover. Steve was from Michigan, and while he was a student, he had played in some of the pioneering punk bands in the Michigan scene, but when those started breaking up, he decided to move to New York. On one of their European tours, Kim and Thurston actually hired Steve to watch their dogs. When Bob ended up leaving the band, Thurston and Kim asked Steve to join without even giving him an audition. They had already seen him play, and they knew how good he was. In 1986, Sonic Youth signed with a new label, one that they were actually really excited to work with. It was SST Records, which was founded by Greg Ginn in order to release music by his band Black Flag. Greg actually originally created it back in his teenage years to sell audio equipment, but when his band needed somewhere to release music, he just kind of turned it into a record label. And then largely off the success of Black Flag and the kind of stature they had in the underground scene, specifically with the hardcore movement that was flourishing at the time, SST Records was kind of like one of the flagship indie labels. It was one of the few that was run by bands and artists that actually seemed to be doing it right and seemed to be able to get the music out there in a way that other little startup indie labels just couldn't. Sonic Youth were the first band from the New York underground scene that signed with SST, and that really got the attention of some of the major media outlets, and it led to New York Times calling Sonic Youth the most original guitar band since Jimi Hendrix.
At the time we started, a whole, uprising of young bands in America started up, like Minor Threat on the East Coast, and you had Black Flag on the West Coast, and they all created their own labels, such as SST and Discord, and Jello Biafra had Alternative Tentacles, and
Touch and Go.
In the Midwest was Touch and Go, and they created an entirely, alternative network to
play and make records.
That was all a new thing, and it was very exciting, and it worked.
Their first album on SST, which was called Evol, was kind of considered a masterpiece of the noise rock movement, and it was their first album that was received really well by critics. Their follow-up album in 1987 was called Sister, and it was kind of a loose concept album based around the life of science fiction author Philip K. Dick. It was called a masterpiece at the time, and it was clear Sonic Youth were figuring out what they wanted to be and what they wanted to sound like. But despite all of that newfound respect, they were kind of falling out of love with SST Records. They didn't like some of the administrative processes and felt like they weren't being paid what they were owed. And also distribution was a little bit slacking on that label. So they inched ever closer to that coveted major label deal and released their next album through Enigma Records. That album, Daydream Nation, was a massive success for them. It was loved in a lot of the more artsy magazines, which was kind of what Sonic Youth was going for, and it even had a single that got some radio airplay called Teenage Riot. This album was really what kind of cemented them as one of the coolest bands on the planet, and it made you feel cool for knowing who they were and listening to them. I think one of the reasons why Sonic Youth was kind of seen as such a cool band is because they were actually doing something different. Like one of the tenets of the no wave movement said, a lot of these punk bands and these hardcore bands were just kind of stripping rock down to its roots and were rehashing some of the old cliches. But what Sonic Youth was doing was totally different, and it was really revolutionary, and that's all the underground scene wanted to be, was revolutionary. So when you heard someone like Sonic Youth, you understood you were listening to something different. And I think that just kind of added to their mystique and added to their popularity. But again, distribution issues really haunted them. There was really only one thing they could do if they wanted to progress in their career. They needed to sign to a major label, which was something that had not gone well for almost every other underground band that had tried to do it. But they tried it regardless, and they signed with Geffen Records in 1990.
Yeah, so we sold out, big deal. I mean, what's it to you? I mean, it's like we've been on an independent label for 10 years. And
they were far from the first underground band to try to make that jump. Band like Husker Du and Jane's Addiction and REM and others had always beaten them to it. But the deal that Sonic Youth was able to sign was kind of unheard of in the underground scene. With the exception of REM, those other bands, the label kind of dictated what they wanted the band to do. Sonic Youth was given unprecedented creative freedom over their own music. It was a 5-album deal worth $300,000, but they were told that their albums would be released through a subsidiary label. By the 90s, you would be hard-pressed to find a band more respected in the underground scene than Sonic Youth. Because of their deep ties to the New York underground world, they had all of the respect of those bands. Also, because of their relentless touring, they had the respect of all of the bands who got to see them play or who got to open for them when they toured. And then because of their connections with SST and in the Pacific Northwest, they had the respect and the attention of all of those bands as well. And I think bands like Black Flag and Minor Threat and those kind of more hardcore bands that were seen as, you know, at the forefront of that underground movement, hardcore maybe necessarily wasn't the it thing anymore, and the SST records had burned a little bit of bridges, so it really kind of was Sonic Youth kind of bridged all of those divides and was the poster child for the indie scene. As kind of to solidify their position as tastemakers, they were arguably one of the most important aspects in getting Nirvana out there. They played with and supported Nirvana way before it was cool. And it's even said that Kim Gordon was the one who recommended Geffen Records sign Nirvana. At this time, they could basically do no wrong. When they released their album Dirty in 1992, they worked with Spike Jonze, who at that time was just directing skateboard videos, and they kind of helped launch his career in music video production and directing. By the mid-90s, when Sonic Youth was playing Lollapalooza, alternative rock was all the rage. Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and all of these kind of more grungy alternative rock bands were hitting it massive. And Sonic Youth had really positioned themselves as one of several bands who could kind of be called godfathers of that scene. All of those bands who were massive really respected them as major influences and would invite them on tours, opening for them. But also in 1994, Kim and Thurston took some time off when their daughter was born. Throughout the 90s and the 2000s, they kept releasing albums, they kept touring. They were even one of the first big rock bands to play in China. They changed up their sound a few times, but mostly they stuck to the formula of doing exactly what they wanted to do, even on their major label, and they had really set themselves up to just kind of ride off into the sunset as this massive, great band. But then in October of 2011, after several more albums, several more great tours, Thurston and Kim shocked the world by announcing their separation, which, of course, that threw the future of the band into confusion. And Lee said they'd be taking a break from Sonic Youth for a while. By November of 2013, Lee seemed pretty pessimistic about the future of the band. When asked if they'd get back together, Lee said, quote, "I fear not. Everybody is busy with their own projects. Besides that, Thurston and Kim aren't getting along together very well since they're split. Let the band rest in peace," end quote. Thurston had said that the band was a democracy, and while him and Kim were at odds, they really couldn't proceed with it. They needed to give it time for them to work out what they were going through. Turns out, Kim had a pretty good reason to be angry at Thurston, since it was later revealed that Thurston had had an affair with a book editor that he had been working with for years, named Eva Prinz. The couple tried marital counseling, but Thurston was never willing to leave Eva. He said, quote, "I'm involved in a really sweet relationship, and it really does make me happy. It truly does. But I'll always have that experience of sadness that a separation brings, especially one that was as important not just to me, but everybody around us. There have been some fallouts, but that's to be expected. It's pretty heavy." End quote. Thurston and Kim officially divorced in 2013. In 2015, Kim released her autobiography called Girl in a Band, in which she really doesn't shy away from starting any drama. Took stabs at Courtney Love, at Lana Del Rey, of course at Thurston. It's worth the read. But in that book, she talks about how much she dislikes Eva even before the whole affair came to light. She talks about finding texts on Thurston's phone that kind of confirmed the affair and confronting him about it. She said, quote, "I just hit a nerve because this woman Thurston's with is a toxic borderline. To have that out in the world as a role model, it's effed up. But I didn't just hate her. If you met her, you would understand." End quote. But through it all, and maybe she's just trying to take the high road, I don't know, she never really seemed to be that angry at Thurston. She called him a lost soul and said he just doesn't really know how to deal with stuff. She said he was going through a midlife crisis. But either way, I don't really see that relationship being able to be repaired, especially not enough to continue working together in Sonic Youth, especially since Thurston and Eva ended up getting married. So far, Thurston has not really commented on anything that Kim said in her memoir or in her interviews, but it's worth noting that Thurston's own autobiography is due out later this year, so that could shed some new light to his side of the story. Since breaking up, Thurston started a new band called Chelsea Light Moving, which released only one album in 2013, and then he joined a black metal band called Twilight, which it seems like is also not really doing anything right now. He's released several solo albums, and he's done some major productions with some like guitar ensembles. He's currently living with Eva in London. During their divorce, Kim was diagnosed with breast cancer, but she had a successful surgery and is currently cancer-free. Also, say hello to my cat. He got jealous that I was talking to someone, not him, so he wanted to join in on the fun. Kim dove headfirst into visual art, saying that her art was kind of sidetracked by the whole music thing she had going on. She's done a little bit of acting, she's worked on some experimental music, and she even released a solo album. After the breakup, Lee Ronaldo released a solo album himself that was pretty straightforward, like kind of more pop rock songs, and it featured both Steve Shelley and Bob Burt on the recordings. He's done some performance art and some guitar pieces, and he's since released several more solo albums, and he's worked as a producer, an artist, a writer, and just kind of really any creative thing that he wants to try. Steve Shelley spent several years playing in a band called Sun Kill Moon, and he's played on Thurston's solo albums as well. We didn't really talk much about this era of the band, but Mark Eibold joined in 2006. He started as a touring musician on the Eternal tour, but he quickly became a full member. He was the bassist for the band Pavement until they split up in 1999, and he was a part of a band called Free Kitten with Kim Gordon. After the split, he wrote a food column for Lucky Peach magazine, and he worked as a bartender for Great Jones Cafe until it closed in 2018. He's since continued being a bartender around New York City and is a part of the Pavement reunion that has been happening. And that's the story of Sonic Youth. Let me know your thoughts below. What did I get wrong? I'm sure there's some stuff. Drop this video a like if you liked it. Consider subscribing if you want to hear more stories from music history, and be sure to drop a comment of what bands or artists you think I should talk about next.